Welcome to our closing session for Imagination Redeemed 2020. It's hard to believe that we've already gotten to the last session. I'm Lancia E. Smith, and this session is titled Recapturing Wonder for a World in Twilight, Cultivating Conditions for Wonder. I want to thank each of you for being here. You are the reason, after all, that we do this, but your participation has been such a blessing to all of us at Anselm. I also want to offer my deep thanks to Brian Brown, Terry Moon, the Anselm Society conference team, and all of our speakers. This group of people brilliantly spun on a dime and figured out, when one thing fell apart, how to turn lemons into sparkling lemonade. And I could not be more proud of the way that this has worked. We're more grateful for their generous efforts, the sacrifices, and honestly, just the brilliant talk. These are some of the most magnificent people I know, and I'm grateful to work in their good company. When I am starting a new work, when I'm struggling to figure out where to start something that has complicated and different elements, more often than not, a paper or talk like this one, and I've reached an absolutely inevitable stage of panic, of having too many elements to pull together into something cohesive, I remember a song from The Sound of Music that wisely reminds me that the very best place to begin is at the beginning, that the beginning is a very good place to start. I'm still learning that telling the truth about something is the very best place to begin. It's the way that I will find my way through the muddle in the middle and eventually arrive with clarity and grace, with some kind of completeness at the end. I'm also learning that in the process, I will remember the opening and the closing lines of the exquisite poem, The Singing Bowl by Malcolm Guite. Let me read it to you. Begin the song exactly where you are. Remain within the world of which you're made. Call nothing common in the earth or air. Accept it all and let it be for good. Start with the very breath you breathe in now. This moment's pulse, this rhythm in your blood. And listen to it, ringing soft and low. Stay with the music. Words will come in time. Slow down your breathing. Keep it deep and slow. Become an open singing bowl, whose chime is richness rising out of emptiness, and timelessness resounding out of time. And when the heart is full of quietness, begin the song exactly where you are. This poem sounds deeply resonant to me of a holy incantation, and perhaps that's what all the best poetry does. I can hear Malcolm saying it, but deeper than Malcolm's voice, I can also hear the Holy Spirit saying it. I will confess to you that being present and aware of where I am at any given moment is not second nature to me, and it never has been. I have to practice every single day being present in this time frame and not disconnecting. Scripture, literature, and poetry are the language that God has used to teach me how to stay here. There's a profound mystery and wonder in what God uses to change and transform lives, to restore. That power to transform and restore is what we can truly and rightly call a holy magic. All the acts of God are holy. The transformation of something from one state or condition to another, no matter where it occurs, is a wonder very much akin to what we might commonly call magic, if we but had the eyes to see it. Magic in the benign and good sense of something being something wonderful, enchanting, mysterious, and supernatural, something we cannot do ourselves with our own common strengths in flesh or by will. Long ago, I read these words, and they have shaped my thinking as a Christian ever since. I would expect that you've probably read or heard them too. Do you think that I am trying to weave a spell? Perhaps I am, but remember your fairy tales. Spells are used for breaking enchantments as well as for inducing them. And you and I have need of the strongest spell that can be found to wake us from the evil enchantment of worldliness which has been laid upon us for nearly 100 years. This passage from The Weight of Glory by C.S. Lewis strikes me all the more deeply as I grow older and more familiar with it. Why? Because here's an adult, deeply Christian man who was as Christian as anybody I have ever read or heard of, using the terms enchantment and spell in an utterly serious way while delivering one of the greatest sermons ever written. Lewis is using the word fairy tales in church as seriously as he references all truth. He offered no apology for those words, no corrective excuses. He doesn't offer a disclaimer or try to frame them with an explanation. Those terms serve the message and the listener. They cut right to the bone and to the heart, swift and clean, surgical. Now, why would a godly man use such language in a sermon like this? But for the fact that he understood that the terms meant what they were intended to be used for. Why did he trust his listeners to understand what he was saying in this context? Why was Lewis at peace with the holiness and the wholesomeness of those terms in context of rooted Christian theology? I would venture to say it has to do with G.K. Chesterton, at least in part. Chesterton had a strong influence on Lewis, and Lewis admired Chesterton greatly. I find that very reassuring. Chesterton, such a brilliant and magnanimous man, lived at a time when pragmatism had gained a death grip in modern Western culture. He was a magnificent defender of the faith, a master of weaving wit and critique together into a blend of humor and observation to expose the madness of his times. He and Lewis had a lot in common. They used their pens like swords in a furious, ongoing battle to save souls and sanity from evil forces, both seen and unseen. Chesterton was a genius with rhetoric, and yet he was equally at home with wonder, and he deeply loved fairy tales. He wrote about them all his life. He loved fairy tales for their delight, but also, and maybe the more deeply, because they were bearers of truth. He prescribed mystery and enchantment as an antidote, saying that we require something more than mere logic to transcend madness and insanity. In Orthodoxy, which I strongly urge you to read if you've never read it, because I think you will find it absolutely delightful. He says, and this is a long quote, so bear with me because it's really worth it. As long as you have mystery, you have health. When you destroy mystery, you create morbidity. The ordinary man has always been sane because the ordinary man has always been a mystic. He's permitted the twilight. He's always had one foot on earth and the other in fairyland. He's always left himself free to doubt his gods, but unlike the Gnostic of our day, free also to believe in them. The fairy tale awakens our minds to the enchanted, mysterious nature of the real world that we live in. It opens to us the possibility that mere atoms and molecules might be full of divine glory. These tales that apples were golden only are told to refresh the forgotten moment when we found that they were green. They make rivers run with wine, only to make us remember for one wild moment that they run with water. We have all read in scientific books, and indeed in all romances, the story of the man who has forgotten his name. This man walks about on the streets and can see and appreciate everything, only he cannot remember who he is. Well, every man is that man in the story. Every man has forgotten who he is. The one may understand the cosmos, but never the ego. The self is more distant than any star. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God, but not know thyself. We are all under the same mental calamity. We have forgotten our names. We have all forgotten what we really are. All that we call common sense, rationality, practicality, positivism, only means that for a certain dead level of our life, we forget that we have forgotten. All that we call spirit and art and ecstasy only means that for one awful instant, we remember what we forget. This right here is a perfect description of the holy nature of art and spirit and remembering. It calls us to marshal every evidence that we can of the good, the true, and the beautiful in every element of our lives and our crafts to make known the goodness of God. It also seals for us that a godly Christian man was not at all afraid of the concepts of enchantment and fairyland, and that those were as real to him as the physical, practical things were in the room he lived in. Now, nowhere have I found a more beautiful and enchanting description of the mystery of language, literacy, and the power of words, especially on this particular subject, than what's offered by Malcolm Guite. In his blog post titled Spell, he addresses the mystery of words and world-making in his customary way that's both illuminating and inspiring. He says of the daily miracle of language, the magical way that words can summon up images that bring with them whole worlds, all the magical correspondences between word and world, a magic witnessed by the way a word like spell means both to spell a word and to make magic, the way chant is embedded in enchantment, the way even the dry word grammar turns out to be cognate with glamour in its oldest magical sense. But if all language is a kind of a spell, it is a good spell, or gospel, as we later shortened that term. For Christian faith points to a single source, the Word, the Logos of God, for both mystery of language and the mystery of being. Christ is the Word within all words, the Word behind all worlds. He goes on to say, certainly Christian writers have reflected on the parallels between the Genesis narrative, in which God says, "Let there be light," and each thing he summons springs into being, and the way the uttering of words, the combination and recombination of a finite set of letters can call into being imaginary worlds, the sub-creations, as Tolkien calls them, that God, in his love, has empowered us to create. It seems that being made as makers, the old word for poets, is one of the ways in which we are all made in God's image. The way that Malcolm Guite explains this here gives us a foundation for seeing the deep-rooted and expansive grace that the Holy God Almighty gives us in learning to seek after righteousness, because we find ever embedded in it the good, the true, and the beautiful. So when I'm talking about the word enchantment, I'm using it with this understanding. The word enchantment did not originally mean to cast a spell. It meant to sing, to chant, to celebrate, to woo in the use of beauty, to draw near with delight and loveliness. And it's used especially for chanting in worship and prayer. We are given a beautiful role of helping to restore the rightful and true understanding of an original word when we use it in its intended goodness and its intended true meaning. When we use enchantment to mean what it really does, to sing and to celebrate, to worship and to delight, to make beautiful for others, we wash some of the mud and the crud caked onto it through time, ignorance, and misuse. If you shepherd words by vocation, this is part of your holy work and calling, the restoration of language. So, enchantment, I will just offer this. Holy enchantment is used for three things. Enchantment is used for restoring memory to what is true around us all the time. Enchantment is used for making visible beauty and goodness that has been hidden. And enchantment is for transforming. I'm going to talk with you for a minute, though, about a world in twilight. Twilight means half-light. It's the period of time after sunset, just before it becomes completely dark in the evening. It's also used sometimes as a description for a way of life on the edge of open society for people living in shadows. Another way to say it, though, is the dwindling of light. And in a wilder and more poetic way, it's called the gloaming. I would offer to you that twilight is where our world is today. The last of the open light is dwindling to its close, and night is not far. George MacDonald is one of my very favorite writers. I knew MacDonald's work long before I had ever heard of C.S. Lewis or Tolkien. In MacDonald's book, A Dish of Orts, which most people have never heard of, he says something piercingly relevant to our topic. It's amazing what he says. He says, "In very truth, a wise imagination, which is the presence of the Spirit of God, is the best guide that a man or woman can have. For it's not the things we see most clearly that influence us the most powerfully. Undefined, yet vivid visions of something beyond, something which eye has not seen nor ear heard, have far more influence than any logical sequences whereby the same things may be demonstrated to our intellect. It is the nature of the thing, not the clearness of its outline that determines its operation. We live by faith, not by sight. Perhaps the most crucial roles of the Christian, especially the artist Christian, is that as the open light of day dims, we need to be increasingly visible light bearers. When the light of day fades, that's when we start turning on smaller lights so we can make our way through the dark hours and try to be able to function for a little while longer before bedtime. We turn on the lights in our houses. We maybe sometimes light candles. If we have to go outside, we'll probably use a flashlight. If we have yards and gardens where we use solar lights, twilight's the time when those lights turn on. Stars come out overhead, but we don't see them all the way yet. In the twilight of evenings, one of the things my husband Peter and I love to do the most is sit out on our back deck and watch for the magic moment when the solar lights in our gardens come on one by one. It's the moment of enchantment in our day, watching those little lights come on as if lit by unseen fairies. They twinkle in the dark and make comforting and cheerful what would otherwise look very forbidding. Twilight is not just a condition of our age. It can be a state of being we sometimes fall into individually. Sorrow, apathy, guilt, even hope too long delayed can wear a heart down to fading embers. Broken hearts linger in twilight, neither completely dead nor fully living. I've known many people like this, and I've been one of them. Let me tell you a story about a use of holy enchantment to bring the dead to life. This is not a story I particularly want to tell, but because it bears a very important element to what we're talking about, I think it's significant to share it with you. Though I tell this story awkwardly, I'm grateful for your forbearance and your willingness to listen to it all the way through. It is not something I talk about easily. Many years ago, I had a beautiful son named Daniel. He was brilliant and funny and handsome and highly gifted as an artist and as a writer, and he was passionately in love with Jesus. Daniel and I share a particular love of epic fantasy and the love of writing stories. When he was 15 and a brand new high school freshman, though he'd been very asthmatic all his life, Daniel was given medical clearance for the first time to go out for a school sport, cross-country track. He was very excited about it, and as it happened, he was able, much to our surprise, to run successfully through the whole season. I never expected he'd be able to run that long. I think he felt triumphant until the last race. In the last race of the season, though, several things went terribly wrong. So wrong that he was flown by a flight-to-life helicopter while he was in a coma. 2 days later, due to massive brain damage that he'd suffered from oxygen deprivation, we had to declare him brain dead and take him off life support. No man of faith, biblical training, or life difficulties overcome prepared us for that. And the night that Daniel died, something real and true in me died with him. I believe if you asked each of his siblings, parents and grandparents, they would each say the same for themselves. I saw a glimpse of darkness in me that night, though, more utterly repellent than anything I have ever seen before or since. I did not know until that night how completely corrupt my soul was. No starless night sky is as dark as the chasm I saw in me. No amount of minimizing it could make it different than what I actually saw. I cursed God. My God. The same God who had died for me, saved me, kept me alive, delivered me. The God I loved and belonged to. Though I was surrounded by mercies and undeserved grace, I entered a twilight period darker than all my addiction combined. If it weren't for the photographs that I shot during that period of time, besides his funeral, I honestly would have no memory of anything except two things during the next 6 months. I remember moving with my little girl Tatiana into an in-law apartment belonging to close friends. And I remember an incident that happened in late April, 6 months later, after Daniel died. That incident shaped the boundary lines for me ever since. One day, I was looking out of my living room window. It was late spring. It was sunset. I lived in a gorgeous place, and the owner of the house was a landscaper and a gardener. And so the landscaping was really stunning, and the setting of the house was really extraordinary, right at the base of the foothills in Boulder, by a creek and quiet. I was looking out the window, and this crabapple tree was in complete, full, astonishing bloom. I was listening to Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma. I can see this as vividly to this day as I saw it the day it happened. The image of the tree in bloom, somehow combined with the perfection of Pavarotti's voice singing, became something completely transcendent. Something unforeseen, like a breath of life, was given back to me. It was as unasked for and unforeseen as Daniel's death had been. God spoke to me in the language of beauty itself. He brought me back to life, speaking a language that had no words, because it was the only language I would have heard. I don't think that it was the emotion of the music, although that's certainly there. It was something deeper than any emotion, something transcendent in that moment itself, a pulling away of the veil between heaven and earth for a few minutes. I was listening to it and seeing it as an ordinary mortal, but what I heard was something sublime, something beyond myself and earth and time. In that moment, I heard a soundless voice that reminded me that life transcends death, and that neither beauty nor love will be bound by death in the end. It was one of those moments of receiving a touch from God's holiness that was pure divinity, not something I easily talk about or can explain. This was a taste of passion beyond emotion or sorrow, a single moment's fluttering of the veil between mortality and eternity. Such is the power of art. God used a language deeper and richer to speak to me when I could have heard no other language. He used a holy kind of an incantation to reawaken me from twilight. He spoke the language of beauty without reprimand or incrimination. There was no blame, though there was plenty of it that was deserved. He completely bypassed my reason and he spoke absolutely fluently in the language of the sublime, using a larger alphabet of nature entwined with the artful work of man to make me remember what death had made me forget, that the light has come into the world, and that the darkness has not, nor ever will, put it out. Please don't think that every artist Christian must sing like Pavarotti or compose like Puccini. Every offering of your work is offered when you offer it like the little boy who gives his loaves and fishes to Jesus for the feeding of the 5,000 is precious. Every offering like that is enough. Offer it with your whole heart, and don't worry if it's the greatest thing that was ever created. I want to draw your attention to this. God had planted a vision in the mind and heart of the man who planted the tree so many years before I came to live there. He was a gardener, as I told you. Hearing Pavarotti sing Nessun Dorma by itself would have made me cry. I know it to be true because I still cry every time I hear it. But it wouldn't have spoken life to me by itself. It was the sight of the tree in bloom, combined with the music, that sang life to me. It made me remember life bigger than me and bigger than all my losses. When my friend Paul had planted that tree all those years before, he didn't know someday I'd be living in that apartment. He didn't know he was planting a tree that would one day be something that God would speak through to save my life. Paul planted beauty simply because it was what he was made to do. He cultivated the conditions for wonder and mystery by planting gardens faithfully while trying to live out his faith as best he could. There's a message for us in that. Cultivating is a deliberate act stemming out of very intentional choices. To cultivate a land, a people, a culture, one has to begin by choosing to. It is not random. It isn't like going out and walking down a street and you just happen to look over and admire flowers. Cultivating by its very nature is a deliberate act of commitment. We must cultivate the conditions in ourselves first for wonder in order to ever be able to share it with others. One of the key ingredients to make room for wonder is to make room to be delighted, to make room to be enchanted without apology. And by that I mean to make room for no longer apologizing that wonder is a part of your life. Enchantment is not just for children, except of course that perhaps it is. Because Jesus said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." One of the inherent necessities to cultivating wonder and mystery, two of the elements, really inherent in enchantment, is to simply believe that wonder exists. It's to believe that a God so infinite that he could create universes and dimensions, molecules and nebulas, angels and humans, can also create fairies and portals to other worlds. He is a serious God, holy, righteous, just, and perfect. He is also merry and he loves to play. When we talk about cultivating wonder, we need to cultivate generosity and humility, leaving room in your heart to be delighted, to be enchanted by God's goodness, is the only way you may ever experience it, let alone be able to share it. Don't be afraid of holy enchantment, and don't be afraid to be marked by it, because if you experience it, you will be marked by it. People know. That's part of why we cultivate it. Sure, some people will laugh at you. You will be belittled. It's part of it. Some will be apathetic. Be brave and generous anyway. Be an agent of grace. Be bigger than how little they make you feel. While some will not understand you and will even try to hinder you, some will be won over by your Christ-like ways, and some will find themselves enchanted into the kingdom. Some will leave prisons of pure pragmatism and find the love of beauty in their own soul through you at Christ's long-offered invitation. Some will experience holy magic of transformation, and they will be healed. The longing for enchantment is in our blood, friends. It's the way we're made. It's the longing to see again what's veiled now, here in the now and the not yet. It's the blood-born longing for wonder, for mystery, for holy magic, for glory, for delight. It's the longing to re-enter the one true story without any stain or shame, fear or hindrance, no baggage, no regrets, no apologies. It's the longing to be more than we are now, because deep planted in us is the inescapable knowing that we are made for more. When we make art, we work to re-enchant. We work to re-enchant not just through craft, but through the way we choose to cultivate and live our lives, the way we welcome others who stand in the shadows still, the way we choose to love and be present, the way we light candles in our windows at night, or hold our candles up to starlight to be lit, the way we plant our gardens and our trees, the way we love. Everything we make of real beauty casts splinters of light in the world. Those splinters of light illuminate what is held in the twilight shadows. That, friends, is why we make art, to reveal what is hidden but everywhere sensed, to restore memory, to rebuild hope, to rekindle courage. If I can offer us a single visual image or metaphor for our calling, to the world especially right now, let me offer this. Be solar lights placed in the gardens and the yards of the world, wherever you're planted, coming to light as darkness falls in ordinary places, casting comfort and cheer to ward off fear and to remind those to see that light of home. Twinkle brightly, friends. The world needs you. Thank you.